Before we begin, right finger if you enjoy slow burn suspense stories with unexpected twists. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new part. When Lena first moved into Maplewood Lane, she thought she had found the kind of neighborhood people only talked about in nostalgic conversations. Tree-lined streets, white fences, morning joggers who waved even if they didn't know your name. It felt safe in a way that made her breathe easier, especially after the years she'd had. Her house was small but charming, a two-bedroom with pale blue shutters and a porch that creaked softly when you stepped on it. On her first morning there, while she struggled with a box labeled kitchen, fragile, a voice spoke behind her. Careful with that. The bottom looks like it's about to give. She turned, startled, and saw a man standing on the edge of the neighboring driveway. Mid-30s, maybe early 40s. Clean cut, casual jeans and a gray hoodie. Nothing remarkable, which somehow made him easier to trust. "I'm sorry," she said, embarrassed. "I didn't realize anyone was watching." He smiled, warm and easy. Hard not to notice when someone's wrestling their entire life out of a cardboard box. He walked over and took the box from her hands before she could object. He carried it like it weighed nothing. "I'm Evan," he said. "Next door, Lena. Welcome to Maplewood." That was how it started. Over the next few weeks, Evan became part of the background of her life. Not in an intrusive way. Just present. He waved when she left for work. Held the door when they crossed paths at the mailbox. Once, when her car wouldn't start, he appeared with jumper cables before she even finished calling roadside assistance. "You don't have to do that," she'd said. "It's no trouble," he replied. "That's what neighbors are for." Everyone else on the street seemed to agree. Mrs. Callahan from across the road told Lena, "You're lucky you live next to Evan. Such a good man. Always helping out." Lena believed it. She wanted to believe it. After what she'd been through, kindness felt like something fragile. Something you accepted carefully, like glass. She didn't talk much about her past, and no one pressed her. She worked remotely for a marketing firm, which meant long hours on her laptop and quiet evenings. Evan never questioned her routine. He never lingered too long. Never asked personal questions. At least, not at first. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street gold, Lena sat on her porch with a cup of coffee. Evan was trimming his hedges next door. He paused and nodded toward her mug. "Decaf or regular?" "Regular," she said. "I need all the help I can get." He chuckled. "Rough day, aren't they all?" He leaned on the handle of the trimmer, wiping his hands on a cloth. "If you ever need quiet around here, just let me know. This neighborhood values peace." The way he said values peace struck her as oddly deliberate, but she brushed it off. "I appreciate that," she said. That night, she slept better than she had in months. The first uncomfortable moment came a week later. Lena returned home late, the sky already dark. As she pulled into her driveway, she noticed Evan standing near the property line, his face lit faintly by the porch light. "Everything okay?" she asked, rolling down her window. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just noticed your light was still off. Thought maybe something happened." Her stomach tightened slightly. "I was working late." "Of course," he said quickly. "Sorry. Didn't mean to pry." He stepped back, giving her space. Still, as she walked inside, she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The next day, a package arrived on her porch. She hadn't ordered anything. Inside was a new porch light bulb. Stronger wattage. A note was taped to the box. "Thought this might help. Streets are safer when they're well lit. E." She stared at the note longer than necessary. It was thoughtful, practical. So why did it bother her? She told herself she was overreacting. Trauma had a way of turning neutral gestures into warnings. Evan hadn't crossed any lines. Not really. So she installed the bulb. That night, Maplewood Lane glowed brighter than ever. As days passed, Evan seemed to know things before she mentioned them. "Big meeting today?" he asked one morning. She blinked. "How did you? You were pacing on the porch last night," he said. "Figured it must be something important." Another time, he commented, "You've been sleeping less lately. I didn't realize it showed." "Everything shows," he said, smiling. "If you pay attention." The word stayed with her. Still, when her sink clogged, he fixed it. When a storm knocked out power, he checked on her first. He never raised his voice. Never made a demand. On the surface, he was everything a neighbor should be. Which made it harder to name the unease curling quietly in her chest. One Friday evening, Lena had a friend over for the first time since moving in. Maya, loud and affectionate, filled the house with laughter. They sat on the couch with takeout containers spread across the coffee table. Halfway through dinner, Maya glanced toward the window. "Is that guy outside staring over here?" Lena's heart skipped. She turned quickly. Evan stood on his porch, phone in hand, facing their direction. When he noticed them looking, he raised his hand in a small wave and stepped back inside. "He's my neighbor," Lena said, too quickly. "He's nice." Maya shrugged. "Probably nothing. Just checking." But later, when Maya left, Lena noticed a message on her phone. "Your friend got home safe." Good. She froze. She hadn't told Evan Maya's name. Or that she was worried about her drive. Lena typed, "How did you know she was my friend?" The response came almost instantly. "I pay attention. That's all." Her fingers hovered over the screen. Something about the certainty in those words sent a chill through her. She locked her doors that night. Double-checked the windows. Told herself she was being ridiculous. After all, Evan was just a kind neighbor. Wasn't he? Lena woke the next morning with the uneasy feeling that she hadn't really slept at all. Her dreams had been shallow and fractured, filled with half-heard footsteps and the sensation of being watched through glass. Sunlight streamed through her bedroom curtains, bright and ordinary, mocking the tension still coiled in her chest. She sat up, telling herself that fear had a way of inventing meaning where there was none. Evan's message had been strange, yes, but strange didn't automatically mean dangerous. In a neighborhood like Maplewood Lane, people looked out for each other. That was the whole point. Still, when she reached for her phone, she noticed she'd locked it sometime during the night without remembering doing so. She spent the morning buried in work, trying to drown out her thoughts with deadlines and emails. Around noon, there was a knock at her door. She froze for a second before reminding herself she was being irrational. When she opened it, Evan stood there holding a small paper bag, the logo of the cafe on the corner stamped neatly on the side. "I grabbed an extra sandwich," he said easily. "Figured you might forget to eat when you're working." His tone was light, friendly, but the words landed heavier than he probably intended. She hesitated, then accepted the bag with a polite smile. "That's thoughtful," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Evan's eyes flicked past her shoulder, briefly scanning the interior of her home before returning to her face. "Everything okay?" he asked. "You seem tired." Lena forced a laugh and nodded, closing the door a little quicker than necessary after thanking him. As the days passed, she became more aware of patterns she hadn't noticed before. Evan's car was always in his driveway when she left and when she returned. He seemed to appear whenever she stepped outside, as if summoned by the sound of her door. When she went for an evening walk, he waved from his porch, sometimes falling into step beside her for a block or two. He never touched her, never said anything overtly inappropriate, yet every interaction carried a subtle pressure, like an invisible hand guiding the conversation. When she mentioned thinking about joining a gym across town, he frowned slightly. "That area isn't very safe at night," he said. "You're better off staying close to home." The comment lingered with her long after they parted, less like advice and more like instruction. One night, Lena decided she was done letting unease dictate her behavior. She invited Maya over again, determined to prove to herself that nothing was wrong. They ordered pizza and turned up the music, laughing loudly, intentionally. For a while, it worked. Then, halfway through the movie, the doorbell rang. Lena muted the TV and exchanged a look with Maya before standing up. Evan was on the porch, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. "Everything okay?" he asked, glancing past her into the living room where Maya sat. "The music's a little loud." Lena felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's early," she said. "And we're not bothering anyone." Evan held her gaze for a beat too long, then nodded slowly. "Of course. Just wanted to make sure." As he turned to leave, his smile never quite reached his eyes. After he was gone, Maya leaned forward, her expression serious. "Lena, that guy makes my skin crawl." Lena sighed, rubbing her temples. He's just protective. This neighborhood is like that. Maya shook her head. Protective isn't the same as controlling. The word echoed in Lena's mind long after Maya left. That night, she lay awake listening to the quiet hum of the street, every passing car sounding louder than it should have. The next morning, she found a note slipped under her door. Didn't mean to make things awkward last night. I just worry. You should be careful who you bring around. Her hands trembled as she read it. She hadn't given him her number for notes. He'd had to come close enough to slide it beneath her door. Close enough to listen. Close enough to watch. She texted back, choosing her words carefully. I appreciate the concern, but I don't need monitoring. The reply came seconds later. I'm not monitoring. I'm protecting. From that moment on, Lena began pulling away. She shortened conversations, avoided eye contact, left the house at irregular hours. Evan noticed. His friendliness sharpened into something else, his smiles tighter, his voice lower. You've been distant, he said one afternoon as she rushed past him. Did I do something wrong? She stopped, forcing herself to face him. I just need space. The word space seemed to irritate him. His jaw flexed, and for the first time since she'd met him, the calm facade cracked. People misunderstand me, he said quietly. I don't like that. That evening, a storm rolled in, thunder rattling the windows. The power flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Lena lit candles and tried to relax, but when she glanced out the window, she saw Evan standing on his porch, staring directly at her house. Rain soaked his clothes, yet he didn't move. Her phone buzzed. Power's out. Don't be scared. I'm right here. Her breath caught in her throat. She typed back, please don't text me right now. There was a pause, longer this time. Then, you don't have to push me away, Lena. I'm only trying to help. As the storm raged on, she realized something had shifted irreversibly. Evan wasn't just a neighbor anymore. He had woven himself into the fabric of her daily life, into her sense of safety, and now he was pulling the threads tight. Lena understood, with a clarity that chilled her, that kindness could be a mask, and that she had unknowingly tested the limits of his patience. Whatever came next would not be an accident. It would be a response. By the time Lena accepted that Evan's presence had crossed from unsettling into oppressive, it felt as though the decision was already too late to matter. Her days began to revolve around avoidance, a careful choreography of leaving the house when his garage door was closed, of taking phone calls in rooms without windows facing his property, of lowering her voice even when she was alone. The realization that she was changing her behavior because of him filled her with quiet anger, but anger was quickly smothered by caution. She reminded herself that nothing he had done was illegal, nothing she could point to and say this is the moment everything went wrong. Yet the pressure was constant, like air slowly being let out of a tire, noticeable only when movement became harder. On Tuesday morning, she found her trash bin already pulled back up to her house, neatly placed beside the fence, even though she distinctly remembered leaving it at the curb. A few hours later, a text appeared on her phone saying, "You forgot it again." No problem. She stared at the message, her pulse hammering, wondering how long he had stood there, close enough to notice, close enough to touch something that belonged to her. At work, Lena struggled to focus, her thoughts looping endlessly around contingency plans she wasn't sure she'd ever need. She researched security cameras during her lunch break, only to close the browser when a wave of guilt washed over her. Installing cameras felt like an accusation, and some small, traitorous part of her still clung to the idea that she was misreading everything. That evening, as she watered the small garden by her porch, Evan appeared at the edge of her yard without making a sound. "You should stop doing that so late," he said casually. Lena jumped, water sloshing onto her shoes. "It's barely 7, she replied, forcing steadiness into her voice. Evan tilted his head, studying her. "People notice routines," he said. "If someone wanted to take advantage, they'd know exactly when you're distracted." The implication hung between them, thick and deliberate. Lena straightened, meeting his gaze. "Are you saying someone's watching me?" Evan smiled faintly. "I'm saying I am." That night, she called Maya and told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush she hadn't realized she'd been holding back. Maya listened in silence before saying, "Lena, this isn't just weird. It's scary." Hearing it out loud stripped away the last of Lena's doubt. Maya urged her to talk to someone, the police if necessary, but Lena hesitated. What would she say? That her neighbor was too attentive. That his concern felt wrong. The idea of being dismissed made her stomach twist. After the call ended, she sat in the dark living room, the house feeling larger and emptier than before. Her phone buzzed again. "You sounded upset earlier. Everything okay?" She didn't respond. Minutes passed. Then another message. "Ignoring me won't fix it." The next morning, Lena woke to find her porch swept clean, fallen leaves gathered into a neat pile by the steps. She hadn't asked for help. She hadn't thanked him. Yet there it was, another reminder that her boundaries were invisible to him. When she stepped outside, Evan stood by his mailbox, watching her reaction. "I thought you'd appreciate it," he said. Lena felt something inside her harden. "I need you to stop doing things for me," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it calm. Evan's expression flickered, confusion giving way to irritation. "I'm being neighborly," he replied. "Most people would be grateful." "I'm not most people," Lena said. The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Evan's jaw tightened. "Careful," he said softly. "You don't want to misunderstand intentions." From that moment, his demeanor shifted. The warmth drained from his voice, replaced by something colder, more precise. He no longer waved, he watched. He no longer offered help, he commented, pointedly, on her choices. "Late night again," he said one evening as she returned home. "Another time, you should lock that window. You never know." Each remark felt like a test, probing how far he could push without provoking open confrontation. Lena began documenting everything, saving messages, writing down dates and times, her notes growing longer each day. The act of recording gave her a fragile sense of control, but it also made the situation feel more real, more dangerous. One afternoon, a delivery truck stopped in front of her house, blocking Evan's driveway for a few minutes. Lena watched from her window as Evan spoke to the driver, his gestures sharp, his posture rigid. Later that evening, her phone chimed. "You need to be more considerate. Your deliveries cause problems." That was the moment something inside her snapped. She typed back, "You don't get to manage my life." The reply came after a long pause. "I do when you won't." Her hands trembled as she read it, the implication clear and unmistakable. That night, Lena dreamed she was trapped in her house while invisible lines tightened around it, drawing closer no matter how hard she pushed against them. She woke before dawn, heart racing, and made a decision she'd been avoiding. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She couldn't keep shrinking. The fear was still there, coiled and ready, but beneath it was a growing resolve. Evan had built his sense of control on her politeness, her hesitation, her hope that things would resolve themselves. She understood now that kindness, once weaponized, could be just as dangerous as open hostility. As the sun rose over Maplewood Lane, casting long shadows across the quiet street, Lena knew that whatever happened next would be the result of a line finally being drawn, and that Evan would not take that lightly. Lena did not sleep that night, not really, and by morning the exhaustion sat heavy behind her eyes, sharpening every sound and movement. The decision she had made before dawn stayed with her as she moved through the house, a quiet certainty replacing the constant questioning that had ruled her thoughts. She couldn't control Evan, couldn't predict his reactions, but she could stop pretending that his behavior was harmless. She began by changing small things that still felt monumental. She blocked his number, adjusted her work schedule, and finally ordered the security cameras she had been debating for weeks. When the delivery confirmation arrived, she felt a flicker of relief, quickly followed by dread at how he might react when he noticed them. Sure enough, that afternoon, as she stepped outside to collect the package, Evan was already there, leaning against the fence as if he'd been waiting. His eyes went straight to the box in her hands. "What's that?" he asked, his tone deceptively casual. Lena met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Security cameras," she said. "For my peace of mind." For a moment, something dark flashed across his face before it was smoothed away. "You don't need those here," he replied. "This is a safe neighborhood." Lena felt her heart pounding but kept her voice steady. "I decide what I need." Evan smiled, but it was tight, brittle. Of course you do, he said, though the words sounded rehearsed, hollow. Over the next few days, the atmosphere on Maplewood Lane shifted subtly, like a storm gathering just out of sight. Evan stopped pretending to be friendly altogether. He didn't speak unless spoken to, but his presence felt heavier than ever. Lena caught him standing at his window late at night, the glow of his living room light framing his silhouette as he stared toward her house. Once, she noticed her side gate standing open when she was certain she'd locked it. Another time, her car alarm went off in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. Each incident alone was explainable, deniable, but together they formed a pattern that made her skin prickle. She reported the disturbances to the non-emergency line, careful with her wording, careful not to sound hysterical. The officer she spoke to was polite but noncommittal. If nothing's been damaged and no direct threats were made, there's not much we can do, he said. When the call ended, Lena felt smaller than ever, as if the walls of her house had closed in a fraction. The cameras arrived the following weekend, and Lena hired a technician to install them while she stayed home, watching Evan's reactions from the corner of her eye. He hovered in his driveway the entire time, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. When the technician left, Evan finally spoke. "You think I'm a threat," he said flatly. Lena took a deep breath. "I think I deserve to feel safe." His laugh was short and humorless. "You don't know what unsafe looks like," he said. "Not really." The comment lingered long after he went inside, echoing in her mind with an unsettling weight. That night, the cameras flickered to life on her phone, showing clear views of her porch, yard, and driveway. Watching the feeds gave her a strange sense of distance, as though she were observing her own life from the outside. For the first time in weeks, she slept for more than a few hours at a stretch. The peace didn't last. A few days later, Lena returned home to find one of the cameras tilted upward, no longer facing the porch. Her stomach dropped. She checked the footage, hands shaking, and saw Evan's figure filling the frame earlier that afternoon. He hadn't rushed. He'd stood there calmly, adjusting the angle with deliberate care before stepping back and looking directly into the lens. The sight of his face so close, his eyes steady and unblinking, made her feel sick. Her phone buzzed almost immediately. "Cameras can be unreliable," the message read. "You should fix that." Fear surged into anger, hot and sharp. She typed back, "Stay off my property." This time, the response took longer. When it came, it was only 2 words. "Or else." From that point on, the tension was unmistakable, visible even to the other neighbors. "Mrs. Callahan asked gently if everything was all right." Lena smiled and lied, unwilling to pull anyone else into the situation. She started staying late at work, then leaving early, trying to minimize time spent at home. But Evan adapted, always seeming to know when she'd be there. One evening, as she unlocked her door, he spoke from behind her. "Running away won't help," he said. She spun around, her heart racing. "Get away from me," she snapped. His eyes narrowed, the calm finally cracking. "You invited this," he said quietly. "All I did was care." That night, the power went out again, plunging the house into darkness. Lena fumbled for her phone, her breath shallow as she checked the camera feeds. One by one, they went black. Panic surged through her as she realized the outage was isolated to her house. Evan's porch light glowed steadily next door. A knock echoed through the darkness, sharp and insistent. "Lena," Evan called, his voice carrying easily. "You shouldn't be alone like this." She backed away from the door, every instinct screaming at her not to open it. "Go away," she shouted, her voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then his voice came again, low and controlled. "You pushed me too far." When the power finally flickered back on, Lena collapsed onto the couch, shaking. She knew then that this was no longer about misunderstandings or misplaced concern. Evan had crossed a line he couldn't step back from, and she had become the focus of something far darker than neighborly interest. As dawn approached, she sat surrounded by the quiet hum of restored electricity, her resolve hardening into something fierce. Fear had ruled her for too long, but now it was loud, undeniable, and it demanded action. Whatever Evan believed he was entitled to, whatever story he'd told himself about protection and care, Lena understood one thing with terrifying clarity: he would not stop on his own. Morning arrived without relief, the pale light exposing the wreckage of Lena's nerves rather than soothing them. She sat at the kitchen table with a mug of untouched coffee, replaying the night in fragments that refused to settle into something logical. Evan's voice at the door. The way the power outage had spared his house. The certainty in his words when he said she had pushed him too far. She knew then that waiting, hoping, enduring, none of it was neutral anymore. Standing still had a cost, and she had been paying it daily. By mid-morning, she packed a small bag and drove to Maya's apartment across town, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, her eyes flicking to the rearview mirror at every stoplight. Maya took one look at her and pulled her into a hug without asking questions. Inside the safety of someone else's space, Lena finally let herself cry, the fear spilling out in uneven breaths as she told Maya everything she hadn't dared to say before. Maya listened, jaw set, then said firmly, "You're not going back there alone." They spent the afternoon planning in low, serious tones. Maya insisted Lena stay the night, maybe longer, but Lena knew avoidance would only delay the inevitable. Evan lived next door. He knew her routines, her house, her habits. Running would confirm whatever narrative he'd already built in his mind. That evening, Lena called the police again, this time more precise, more resolved. She described the power outage, the camera tampering, the messages. The officer took notes and suggested filing a report in person. It wasn't the immediate protection she wanted, but it was a start. When the call ended, she felt both exposed and steadier, like someone who had finally stepped into the open after hiding in shadows. Lena returned home the next day with Maya riding shotgun, the presence beside her a small anchor against the tension tightening her chest as Maplewood Lane came into view. Evan's car was gone, which should have been a relief, but instead it set her nerves humming. Inside, the house looked untouched, ordinary, as if nothing had happened. That normalcy felt like a trap. They checked the cameras, 2 were still offline. Maya helped her reset them while Lena called the installation company, documenting everything. As dusk fell, the street grew quiet, the familiar calm now oppressive. When Evan's car finally pulled into the driveway, Lena's pulse spiked. He didn't get out right away. He sat there, engine idling, as if considering something. Then he stepped out and looked straight at Lena's house. He didn't come over that night. Instead, her phone buzzed with a message she hadn't blocked because she needed the record. "I see you brought backup," it read. "That won't change anything." Maya swore under her breath, urging Lena not to respond. Lena agreed, but the restraint burned. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she wasn't alone, that he didn't own the street or her life. She stayed silent, knowing that silence itself had become a boundary. The following days were a study in escalation without spectacle. Evan stopped communicating directly, but his presence intensified. He mowed his lawn at dawn, the engine roaring beneath her window. He parked his car inches from the property line. He hosted loud gatherings that ended abruptly whenever she stepped outside, the sudden hush feeling deliberate. Once, Lena found a flyer taped to her door advertising a neighborhood watch meeting at Evan's house. Her name was circled in red ink. Maya insisted they keep it as evidence. Each incident was small enough to explain away, but together they pressed in on Lena's mind like a tightening vice. She filed the police report in person, sitting under fluorescent lights while recounting events in careful order. The officer listened, nodding, asking clarifying questions. "We'll do a drive-by," he said. "If he contacts you again or steps onto your property, call us immediately." It wasn't a promise of safety, but it was acknowledgement, and that mattered. Leaving the station, Lena felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength. She had named the thing she was afraid of. That gave it shape, limits, something to push against. Back home, she and Maya installed additional motion lights and reinforced the locks. The house began to look fortified, less like a home and more like a statement. That night, as the lights clicked on with movement outside, Lena watched the camera feed. Evan stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the property line, his face lit starkly by the motion sensor. He didn't cross it. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, staring into the lens. Minutes passed. Then his phone buzzed in Lena's hand. You think rules protect you, he wrote. Rules are just stories people agree to. Her stomach twisted, but she didn't look away from the screen showing him motionless in the light. Sleep became a negotiation she rarely won. She dreamed of doors without locks and voices calling her name from just outside the frame. Each morning, she woke more resolved than the last. She began reaching out to neighbors, careful and factual, asking if they'd noticed anything unusual. A few hesitated, uncomfortable, but one admitted Evan had always made her uneasy. Another said he'd complained excessively about Lena to anyone who would listen. The narrative he'd been building was starting to show its seams. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived addressed to Lena. Inside was a formal notice accusing her of harassment and disruption, demanding she cease provocative behavior. Maya laughed bitterly when she read it. "This is intimidation," she said. Lena scanned the page again, noting the absence of a lawyer's name. Evan's attempt at control had taken on a new form: paper, language, authority. Instead of panicking, Lena added the letter to her growing file and made another call to the police to report it. Each step felt heavy, but each one also carved out space where fear had been. As night fell, Evan's house went dark, an unusual change. Lena watched the camera feeds, the quiet stretching thin. Then, a final message arrived. "I don't like being ignored." Lena typed slowly, deliberately. "Do not contact me again." She sent it, screenshot it, and set the phone down. For the first time since this began, her hands were steady. She didn't know what Evan would do next. She only knew that standing still was no longer an option, and that whatever came would meet a woman who had finally chosen to move. The days that followed were a tense ballet of observation and restraint. Lena woke each morning with the same tight coil in her chest, scanning the street through the blinds before allowing herself to move. Maplewood Lane, once comforting in its quiet normalcy, had transformed into a stage where every neighbor, every car, every shadow seemed a potential player in Evan's silent game. She had fortified her home, installed motion sensors, added locks to windows that had never needed them, and yet, despite every precaution, she felt the invisible pressure of his watchful presence pressing closer. Evan had shifted tactics, adapting to her defenses. He no longer left notes or messages, but instead acted indirectly, making her life an ever-present reminder of his reach. The morning trash would be neatly placed, groceries arranged as though he had entered while she was at work, porch chairs subtly repositioned, lawn ornaments shifted just enough to catch her attention. Each small intrusion reminded her that he knew the ins and outs of her daily patterns with frightening precision. Lena sometimes caught him watching from his windows, his eyes flicking to her yard whenever she stepped outside. Once, as she took a late-night walk to clear her mind, she saw him standing on his porch, head tilted slightly as though noting the exact moment she passed. She began journaling everything, documenting timestamps, messages, odd occurrences, and details that she had initially brushed off. The act of recording events gave her a sense of agency she had been missing, though it did little to relieve the suffocating tension. One afternoon, while reviewing footage from her cameras, Lena noticed movement on her side of the fence that she hadn't seen. The feed showed Evan crouching, adjusting something near the ground, then stepping back casually as though nothing had happened. She paused, heart hammering, zooming in to see that he had adjusted the angle of one of her motion sensors. It wasn't vandalism, not technically, but it was deliberate. It was a demonstration of control. The reality of what she was dealing with became undeniable. Evan was no longer just a difficult neighbor. He was methodically weaving himself into the rhythm of her life, asserting dominion where she had assumed none existed. That night, she spoke to Maya, her voice a mixture of exhaustion and fury. "He's watching everything," Lena said, gripping her phone tightly. "Every movement, every step, every little thing I do outside my house. It's like he thinks he owns the space I live in." Maya's response was blunt. "Then it's time he knows you won't be ruled." Lena's hands trembled as she considered what that meant, the mixture of fear and resolve tightening her chest. Over the next several days, Lena executed her plan in small increments, testing the boundaries she had ignored for too long. She began leaving her house at odd hours, running errands when Evan was clearly home. She walked in areas he couldn't see, taking indirect routes to obscure her path. She even started talking to other neighbors about seemingly trivial things, observing their reactions, noting how aware he seemed to be of her actions. He would occasionally appear in the periphery, his movements calculated, watching from his driveway or standing in a doorway as though catching only the edge of her activity. The message was clear: he was aware of every attempt to reclaim control, and he did not approve. One evening, Lena was home alone when she noticed a shadow moving across her porch. The streetlights flickered, and she froze. It was him, Evan, crouched briefly near her steps, then retreating as though daring her to notice. Her fingers shook as she grabbed her phone, dialing 911. When the operator answered, she explained the situation carefully, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "He keeps entering my property," she said. "I don't know what he'll do next, but I can't ignore it anymore." The dispatcher assured her officers were on their way. Lena placed her phone down, hiding in the shadows of her kitchen as if her presence could go unnoticed, watching for any sign that he would escalate further. Minutes later, the police arrived, patrolling the street while Lena stayed safely inside. Evan retreated to his house without incident, but the encounter left a mark. He didn't speak, didn't look at her, but Lena felt his eyes behind every shutter, every curtain, every reflective surface. His control had not vanished, it had only shifted. He was patient, strategic, calculating. The following morning, a package arrived at her door, unsigned, containing items she had not ordered: a small flashlight, a notebook, a pen, and a note in handwriting she immediately recognized. "Preparation is everything. Don't be careless." Lena's stomach churned. He had escalated from observation to direct communication again, subtle, threatening, and omnipresent. She placed the package on the counter, photographing its contents for her records. This was no longer a neighborly obsession, this was intimidation, a demonstration of power over her life. The realization left her trembling, but underneath the fear, a slow burn of resolve began to form. Determined not to let him dominate her entirely, Lena began taking measures to reassert herself. She researched legal options, consulting a lawyer about restraining orders and documentation of harassment. She reinforced her home's security with additional cameras and alarms. She trained herself to leave the house confidently at random times, refusing to let his behavior dictate her schedule. Each act of defiance was small but deliberate, a quiet rebellion against the control Evan sought to maintain. Even as she regained some measure of agency, the psychological toll was undeniable. Every knock, every flicker of light, every unexpected sound kept her on edge. Evan's presence was a constant, a shadow looming just outside her perception, reminding her of the fragile line she was crossing. Yet, Lena refused to shrink further. She understood now that fear could not be the compass of her life. Her boundaries, once invisible to him, would need to be asserted forcefully and without hesitation. By the end of the week, Lena's routine had evolved into a careful blend of observation, defense, and subtle aggression. She no longer fled from his presence, she monitored him as closely as he monitored her. The cameras captured every movement on her property, every vehicle that stopped on the street, and every shadow that crossed her perimeter. She documented each interaction, each incident, building a record not just for herself but for the authorities who had begun to take her seriously. One night, as she reviewed the footage, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. Evan was standing in the street, staring at her house with a level of intensity that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He wasn't moving. He wasn't gesturing. He was waiting. A chill ran down her spine. She could sense the weight of his attention like a tangible thing, pressing against the walls of her home. Her hands hovered over the phone, ready to dial, ready to summon help if needed. But she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and reminded herself of the one truth she had begun to embrace: fear was not a leash. Fear was a signal, and she was done being led. Lena realized, with an almost shocking clarity, that Evan's obsession had a limit. It had a shape, and she was beginning to understand it. Every message, every intrusion, every subtle act of intimidation was part of a pattern, and patterns, once recognized, could be anticipated. She had begun to reclaim the narrative of her life, even as he tried to dominate it. That night, as the street fell silent and the shadows lengthened, Lena understood something crucial. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she was no longer standing still. She had stepped forward, and Evan would soon learn that she was capable of far more than fear alone. The days that followed marked a turning point in Lena's battle with Evan. The once subtle presence that had hovered around her life now felt more deliberate, like a challenge daring her to respond. She moved through her house with heightened awareness, checking locks, doors, and cameras multiple times a day. Each sound outside, footsteps, a car engine, the rustle of leaves, made her flinch, her mind instantly picturing Evan's figure in every shadow. Yet, amidst the fear, Lena felt something unfamiliar: resolve. For months, she had been on the defensive, reacting to his moves, retreating, shrinking her world in an attempt to stay unnoticed. But now, after countless sleepless nights and mounting evidence of his obsession, she realized that waiting and hiding had only given him more power. It was time to break the silence, to step into the light and reclaim her life from the man who had sought to control it. The first step was strategy. Lena began meticulously documenting every action, every message, every abnormal occurrence. She built a folder on her laptop labeled Evan Surveillance, each incident recorded with timestamps and photographs. Every package left on her porch, every note slipped under her door, every instance of him watching from a distance was catalogued. The sheer volume of evidence filled her with a mixture of dread and empowerment. She could see the pattern emerging clearly now: his behavior was escalating, deliberate, and increasingly invasive. The documentation wasn't just for her protection, it was a shield, a weapon should she need it. Maya became more than a confidant, she was an anchor. They spent long evenings reviewing security footage together, analyzing Evan's movements, discussing contingencies, and planning routes when Lena needed to leave her home. The camaraderie provided Lena with a sense of normalcy she hadn't felt in months. Maya's presence also acted as a subtle deterrent. Evan had begun noticing patterns, but he hadn't anticipated that Lena could recruit support. The very act of asserting that she wasn't alone shifted the psychological balance subtly but powerfully. One evening, Lena decided to confront the fear directly. She left her house at twilight, deliberately taking a route she knew Evan could see. She walked slowly, arms crossed, head held high, as if daring him to react. Across the street, his silhouette appeared briefly behind his curtain before retreating. Lena felt the old surge of fear but countered it with steady breathing and quiet determination. She knew that visibility was a form of empowerment, a statement that she would no longer vanish into her own house to avoid him. Returning home, Lena found another note slipped beneath her door. It was written in careful, deliberate handwriting: "Walking around alone doesn't change anything. You belong here, in my sight." Her fingers trembled as she read it, but this time she refused to respond with fear. Instead, she photographed it, filed it with the rest of her evidence, and set it aside. This was no longer just a note, it was a declaration of his obsession, one she now recognized and catalogued. Days later, Lena arranged for a consultation with a security specialist. Cameras, alarms, reinforced locks, and motion sensors were upgraded. The technician explained the most effective methods to create layers of security, ensuring no one could approach the house without detection. Lena absorbed every detail, determined to make her home a fortress not only physically but psychologically. The upgrades were subtle, maintaining the appearance of a normal house while creating a labyrinth of deterrence. She wanted Evan to realize, without confrontation, that his control was no longer absolute. But Evan, predictably, adapted. He began monitoring her, indirectly, using neighbors' observations and subtle timing cues. Lena noticed it through minor details: a trash bin moved slightly when she returned from errands, flowers in the yard pruned just so, subtle changes in her garden that hadn't been hers. Every act was calculated, demonstrating awareness and reach. It was infuriating, but Lena had grown more disciplined. Each intrusion was met with evidence collection, careful reporting to authorities, and increasingly, quiet, controlled confrontation in her own mind. She rehearsed scenarios where she might need to face him directly, focusing on staying calm, precise, and unyielding. One evening, Evan escalated further. Lena was home alone, reviewing footage from the new cameras, when her phone buzzed with a message she hadn't blocked: "Rules are temporary. I will not be ignored." Her stomach tightened, but instead of panicking, she typed deliberately, "Your actions are harassment. Stop." Seconds later, another message arrived, "You can't stop me. You never could." Lena's fingers hovered over the phone, shaking, but she forced herself to take a deep breath. She replied, "I am documenting everything. Authorities are aware." The silence that followed was heavier than any message could convey. For the first time, Evan didn't immediately respond, and that pause was enough to instill in Lena a quiet sense of power. The following day, Lena met with the police again, armed with her meticulously organized documentation. Every camera photo, every message, every note, every odd occurrence was presented in detail. The officers listened, taking notes, asking pointed questions about the patterns she had identified. Lena felt a sense of vindication. For the first time, her fears were being taken seriously. The officers assured her that any further harassment or direct contact would be treated with urgency. Lena left the station feeling a cautious sense of control, tempered by the knowledge that Evan's obsession was far from over. That night, the street fell silent. Lena sat in her living room, watching the feed from the cameras she had installed herself. The stillness was almost unnatural. Then she noticed him, Evan, standing at the edge of his driveway, his posture rigid, watching her house. He didn't move. He didn't speak. The cameras captured every moment, and Lena watched, steady but alert, her pulse a measured beat of vigilance. The old fear was still there, but now it was tempered by strategy, preparation, and the awareness that she had taken control of the narrative. In the following days, Lena continued to assert her boundaries through deliberate, calculated actions. She no longer avoided him. She left the house confidently, made her movements unpredictable, and reinforced the understanding that she would not be dominated. Evan's attempts at intimidation became more transparent, less subtle, because he was met with resistance instead of compliance. Lena realized that the psychological game had shifted. He could observe, he could threaten, but he no longer held the power he had assumed was absolute. One evening, she received a final message from Evan, terse and unyielding, "You think you are safe. You were not." Lena stared at the words for a long moment, then carefully documented them. She didn't respond. Instead, she reviewed the cameras, checked the locks, and made a plan for the next day. Fear was still present, but it was no longer the dominant force. She had learned that boundaries, documentation, and decisive action were her tools. Evan might continue to test them, but she would not be passive. She understood now that survival wasn't about hiding, it was about standing, moving, and claiming space even when every instinct screamed to flee. That night, Lena lay in bed, listening to the quiet hum of her house and the occasional distant sound of the street. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of calm. Evan's presence had been a constant, a shadow in her life, but it no longer held her captive. She had confronted the fear, documented the aggression, strengthened her defenses, and engaged support from authorities and friends. Standing firm had come at a cost: sleep, peace of mind, and emotional exhaustion, but it had also brought clarity and control. Lena understood now that the final confrontation, when it came, would not be the end of fear. It would be the proof of her resilience, the moment her boundaries could no longer be tested without consequence. And for the first time since this ordeal began, she felt ready. The tension that had gripped Lena for months had reached a breaking point. Every morning, every evening, every shadow on Maplewood Lane had carried the weight of Evan's silent scrutiny. But now, after weeks of careful documentation, strategic actions, and the unwavering support of Maya and law enforcement, Lena felt a hard, unyielding determination settle inside her. The fear was still there, yes, a sharp reminder of the danger she had faced, but it had been tempered by control, preparation, and courage. She understood, finally, that this confrontation was inevitable. The question was not if it would happen, but when, and she would meet it on her terms. That afternoon, she checked the cameras one last time before leaving the house. Her eyes scanned every frame: the front yard, the side gates, the driveway, and the street beyond. The footage showed Evan pacing his driveway, arms crossed, watching. His attention was fixed, but Lena no longer felt trapped by it. She had prepared herself to reclaim her space, to stand openly without fleeing. She texted Maya, stay nearby. I'm going to do this today. Moments later, she slipped on a jacket, gripped her keys, and walked to the front door with deliberate steps. Outside, Evan's gaze followed her immediately. He didn't speak, but his stance was tense, expectant, almost predatory. Lena's heart beat steadily, the months of fear condensed into sharp clarity. She stopped a few feet from the edge of her property, meeting his eyes directly. For the first time, she spoke aloud, her voice strong and unwavering. "This ends now, Evan. You are done controlling my life. I will not be intimidated, and I will not tolerate harassment." His eyes narrowed, lips parting slightly as though surprised. The calm, calculated facade he had maintained for so long flickered, replaced by the raw intensity she had glimpsed months ago. "You don't understand," he said slowly, his voice low. "I've only ever wanted to protect you. Everything I've done, it's for your safety." Lena shook her head, each word deliberate. "No, what you've done is obsession. Harassment. Control. That's not protection. That's fear disguised as care. And I refuse to live under it anymore." Evan stepped closer, but she didn't move back. Instead, she held her ground, aware of every inch, every gesture, every potential threat. Her phone was ready, authorities were informed, cameras captured every moment. The balance of power had shifted. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was taut, charged with months of tension, fear, and silent battles. Evan's eyes flickered, betraying frustration, disbelief, and, Lena dared to think, realization. She had changed the rules without shouting, without running. She had reclaimed the narrative, showing him that observation, intimidation, and proximity were no longer enough to dominate her. Finally, Evan spoke, his tone quieter, almost defeated. You think you can just take control. Just like that." Lena's response was firm. "I already have. And from now on, every action you take will have consequences. Harassment isn't protection. It's a crime." She reached into her bag, pulling out the organized folder of documentation. "Every note, every message, every act of intrusion, I have evidence. I have authorities watching. This is not a warning. This is reality." For the first time, Evan's posture faltered. The certainty that had fueled his actions, the unyielding belief in his own right to dominate, wavered. He was silent, his eyes flicking briefly to the cameras, to the folder she held, to the authority she had marshaled with careful, patient planning. Lena felt the weight of months of fear, sleepless nights, and relentless observation lift fractionally, replaced by a cautious hope. She had shown him boundaries he could no longer ignore. She had defined the limits of his influence. After several tense minutes, Evan finally stepped back. "You're different than I expected," he said, his voice low. There was no warmth, no threat, only acknowledgement. Lena didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had made herself clear. Her boundaries had been established, her position unshakable. For the first time, Evan no longer had the unchallenged power he had assumed. That night, Lena watched the street from her porch, the quiet feeling different somehow. The tension had not vanished completely, but it had shifted. She had faced the fear head-on, confronted the obsession, and emerged with agency intact. Maya called later to check in, and Lena felt the warmth of connection, the reassurance that she was not alone in holding her ground. She knew that vigilance would always be necessary, but she also understood that strength was no longer a matter of reaction, it was now a matter of proactive control. Over the following weeks, life on Maplewood Lane began to settle into a new rhythm. Evan remained next door, but his behavior changed. He no longer left notes or messages, no longer tampered with cameras or intruded in small, calculated ways. The police had followed up regularly, documenting interactions and making clear that harassment would not be tolerated. Lena's documentation had given her leverage, her preparedness had given her courage, and her willingness to confront fear directly had established limits Evan could no longer cross without consequence. Lena slowly began reclaiming parts of her life she had shelved during the months of intimidation. She took walks at dusk without feeling watched, entertained friends at home, and allowed herself small, simple pleasures she had denied herself. The oppressive shadow that had dominated her days was still a presence, but it was no longer controlling her. She had transformed fear into clarity, anxiety into action, and oppression into a renewed sense of self. Months later, Lena stood on her porch, a cup of coffee in hand, the morning sun spilling over the quiet street. She thought back to the first days she had moved here, to the small, insidious ways Evan had encroached upon her life. She remembered the fear, the sleepless nights, the moments when she had questioned her own judgment. And yet, she also remembered the steps she had taken, the evidence she had collected, the support she had marshaled, and the courage she had discovered within herself. Evan's house remained across the street, quiet and unobtrusive. The man who had once seemed omnipresent and omnipotent had been rendered limited by her insistence on boundaries, documentation, and the law. She no longer feared his gaze, his messages, or his presence. She had proven to herself, more than anyone, that fear could be confronted, controlled, and ultimately, overcome. Lena took a deep breath, savoring the warmth of the sun and the crispness of the air. Maplewood Lane, once a stage for silent control and hidden threats, was now simply home. She had reclaimed it, not by running, not by hiding, but by standing firm, documenting reality, and asserting her rights. She had drawn the lines Evan had once thought invisible, and in doing so, she had drawn herself back into her own life. For the first time in months, Lena felt the quiet satisfaction of control, of agency, and of peace, not the fragile peace of denial, but the resilient peace of victory. Fear had been loud, threatening, and relentless, but courage had been louder. And in that clarity, Lena knew she had emerged stronger than she had ever imagined, ready to live fully in a space she owned, without compromise, without intimidation, and entirely on her own terms.